Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and today I wanted to talk about the 4 best win-win trades in the NBA since the year 2000. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because obviously the NBA trade deadline is around and there's been a lot of moves going on. And I'd say that probably 80% of the time in those bigger moves, not necessarily smaller trades, but when bigger names are involved, there's a very clear winner most of the time. But in these specific trades, big pieces were moved and both teams actually turned out fairly well afterwards. And with all that said, before we get started with the actual video, be sure to leave a comment down below of which trade that happened at this year's NBA trade deadline do you think could potentially be on this kind of list moving forward? Which one do you think was a win-win or will end up being a win-win for both teams? But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Number 1, Carmelo Anthony to the New York Knicks. Back in February of 2011, amid some rumors that Carmelo Anthony had his eyes on being a New York Knick in the following offseason, the Denver Nuggets shipped him and Chauncey Billups to the Knicks for Wilson Chandler, Raymond Felton, Danilo Gallinari, Timofey Mozgov, and some picks, most notably a 2016 first-round draft pick that became Jamal Murray to the Denver Nuggets. This was a trade that was long rumored to be coming eventually, even though the Knicks could have just waited until the offseason to sign Anthony outright with cap space. They decided to go ahead and move a significant amount of assets to get him before the offseason. And at the time, there were some pretty mixed opinions. A lot of people saw this as a good move for Denver to get rid of a player that didn't want to be there anymore in Melo and get a ton of pieces to continue to build moving forward, while for the Knicks, they got one of the best players in the league at the time, taking out of the picture the fact that they again just could have signed him in free agency. And now to the win-win part of this whole equation, starting with the New York Knicks. Once New York acquired Carmelo Anthony, they had one of the more successful stretches in franchise history, and certainly within the time period in which this video takes place, being since 2000. They made the playoffs in 2011, 12, and 13, and won their only playoff series of the century in 2013, a season in which they also won 54 games. They had some pretty great moments with Melo on the roster, and even though they were never really a championship contending team with him, and it was a pretty short era, those Knicks teams did bring the franchise some rare success. For Denver, they also made the playoffs in 2011, 12, and 13, including 50-plus win seasons in 2011 and 2013, 13 being a 57-win season in which they finished with the 2 seed in the West. A season in which they unfortunately did lose in the first round of the playoffs, but nonetheless is their most successful regular season in recent history. And going even further than that, as I've broken down in a previous trade rewind video about the Melo trade, a lot of Denver's current roster and the success that they're having can still be traced back to this original trade, most specifically, like I said, with the pick that they acquired that allowed them to select Jamal Murray. So in the end, this did positively impact both teams, the Nuggets both in an immediate sense, as well as now for their current team, and the Knicks in a much more immediate sense. And again, the big takeaway from this is just the Knicks should have waited until the offseason to sign Carmelo and keep these assets and move forward with him. But even with that said, once again, this is very much a win-win situation for both the Nuggets and the Knicks. Number 2, Pau Gasol to the Los Angeles Lakers. In February of 2008, Pau Gasol was traded to the LA Lakers along with a 2010 second-round draft pick in exchange for Kwame Brown, Jarvis Crittenton, Aaron McKie, and the rights to Marc Gasol, Pau's younger brother, and 2008 and 2010 first-round draft picks. Now, on the surface, there was a pretty big uproar about this trade because it didn't really seem like Memphis got very much out of it, and it allowed the Lakers to go on and win the 2009 and 2010 NBA championships, with Gasol picking up a ton of slack for the nearly constantly injured but talented Andrew Bynum. And initially, you really couldn't blame people for being upset in terms of a lack of return that the Grizzlies got in exchange for Gasol, because apart from the very last piece of the deal, they really didn't get anything out of this, but they ended up with Marc Gasol being Pau's younger brother, and he has turned out to be a focal point and a franchise cornerstone of the era that followed Pau Gasol's tenure with the team. He became a core part of not only the team's success that they had in the grit and grind era, but also very much embodied just the way the team was run, and that grit and grind style was very much something that was associated with Marc Gasol, along with guys like Mike Conley, Tony Allen, and all those guys. So even though initially you might look at it and say, why didn't the Grizzlies get more? And they really didn't get a ton out of this. So where is the win-win part coming from? Well, obviously for LA, it's the championships and the fact that Pau Gasol, like I said, continually stepped up year after year, even though Andrew Bynum was very talented and had a lot of good games. really couldn't stay on the floor, especially in multiple postseasons. And again, Pau Gasol was a big part of them winning those championships. And for the Grizzlies, it's just the fact that Gasol helped them become the grit and grind Grizzlies that we knew for so long. And even though that era is seemingly coming to an end, if it hasn't already, I'm recording this video before the trade deadline. So if he has been traded, I apologize. But he was such a huge part of that team that I don't think you could ever look back on this trade as anything but a win for the Grizzlies, even though initially it really didn't seem like they were going to get all that much out of it. Number 3, Paul George to the Oklahoma City Thunder. Back in July of 2017, Paul George, who was then a member of the Indiana Pacers, let the team know that he intended on signing elsewhere when he hit free agency in 2018, and as a result was shopped around to a number of teams around the league, ultimately ending up with the Thunder in exchange for Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis. And honestly, out of the other entries on this list, it's probably between this move and the Pau Gasol trade that I just talked about in terms of how many people saw this as such a lose situation for one team that ended up being such a win-win in the long run. Because initially, and I'll put myself in this category as well, a lot of people were very confused about the fact that this was all that the Pacers got back for an all-NBA caliber player in George. It's not that Sabonis and Oladipo did not show promise, it's just that both of them came off subpar seasons with the Oklahoma City Thunder, and it turned out that that was as a result of being miscast in some weird roles for them personally and them suffering as a result, and then also the growth that they've continued to show in Indiana. But at the time, this didn't seem like a ton of value. You have to keep in mind that even though Oladipo showed a lot of promise in Orlando, his one season with the Thunder was pretty disastrous, especially in the playoffs, and Sabonis was basically a glorified stretch big for the Thunder in his first season in Oklahoma City because they needed spacing just that badly. And so on the surface, everybody thought that the Thunder just absolutely won the trade and the Pacers absolutely lost it because, like I said, the Thunder were getting a player of Paul George's caliber. But the way that it's worked out has actually turned out really well for both teams. The Thunder somehow were able to convince Paul George to re-sign and stay in Oklahoma City, and he's now in contention for potentially a first-team All-NBA spot this season. And then the Pacers turned Victor Oladipo, or at least Victor Oladipo turned into, once he got to Indiana, an All-NBA caliber player himself. And then Sabonis is one of the better young bigs in the league and continues to rise in terms of his talent, his production, and someone to continue to look out for as a possible future All-Star. And the reason for why this worked out as such a win-win trade when it didn't look like it would initially is because of a couple of things. One, obviously Paul George staying with the Thunder. Had he bolted to LA and they got nothing for him after giving up those assets, obviously that wouldn't have been great for the Thunder. That definitely would have been a loss for them. And then also the fact that Oladipo and Sabonis committed themselves to continuing to get better, and the coaching staff at Indiana finding them new roles and helping them feel much more comfortable there than they did in Oklahoma City made this one of the more unlikely but very real win-win trades in NBA history since the year 2000. Number 4, Kevin Love to the Cleveland Cavaliers. In August of 2014, a disgruntled Kevin Love let it be known that he no longer wanted to be a Minnesota Timberwolf, and he was traded to the Cleveland Cavaliers, who had recently signed LeBron James in free agency in exchange for, among other assets that aren't really all that important, essentially Anthony Bennett and Andrew Wiggins, who had just been selected with the first overall pick. Out of all the other trades on this list, I feel like this one specifically is probably going to get me the most heat in terms of putting it on this list, because for one side, it's pretty obvious why this was a win. The Cleveland Cavaliers, even with all of the relative dysfunction that came with a good amount of LeBron James's time in his return to Cleveland, they did end up with an NBA championship to their name in 2016, and Kevin Love was a huge part of that, along with obviously Kyrie Irving and LeBron James. And they only had to give up some other stuff, but basically Andrew Wiggins, and we'll talk about his impact in Minnesota in a second. But anytime you make a trade that directly impacts a team's ability to win an NBA championship, and then they actually go on to win that championship, especially in a team situation like Cleveland's, where it had been so long since the city itself had experienced a championship, it's definitely a win. You cannot deny that this trade was a win for Cleveland. And even though Kevin Love is still with the Cavaliers and he has a pretty bad contract moving forward, you can't really judge this trade based on those moves and based on the fact that the Cavaliers decided to re-sign him to that, but basically just that 4-year window in which LeBron James was a Cavalier and they were able to surround him with enough good players, and including Kevin Love, obviously, to win an NBA championship. But now we move to the side that probably a lot of you are saying, why is Minnesota on this list? They didn't really win this trade necessarily, and here's why. Even though Andrew Wiggins isn't the best player right now, he's not necessarily an all-star, definitely not an all-star caliber player, it's not like they really were in a positioned to bargain very well in this kind of situation. Kevin Love, it was known that he did not want to be in Minnesota anymore, and even though you can look back and say, oh, they could have gotten Klay Thompson or whoever else in any of these kinds of scenarios, in the end, this is the trade that they made. This is the one that we knew was on the table and that they took. And even though Wiggins is not the best player, as I said, two things continue to bring down his value, and two things continue to cause people to really hate on him a ton, and some of it's warranted, some of it not so much. One, yes, the contract is awful, but that's Minnesota's fault for giving it to him. He has every right to demand it. It's Minnesota's fault for then going ahead and giving it to him. And the other thing is he is still young. Plenty of players have figured out their NBA game, how they fit, what their role is, and have become much better players later on down the line. So I think we're very much still in a wait-and-see scenario for Andrew Wiggins, but in terms of what they got back, the value they got back for a player that didn't want to be there anyway in Kevin Love, a player as promising and continually promising as Andrew Wiggins should be seen as a positive. And yeah, that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, as I said in the beginning, if any of the recent trades that have happened around the NBA trade deadline strike you as a possible win-win trade moving forward, be sure to let me know which one that is down in the comment section below, and I'd be glad to take a look and let you guys know what I think. But with all that said, once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.